Squatting Slav TV.
For the past several weeks, the streets of Paris have been home to some of the largest anti-government protests witnessed in France in over 3 decades. Hundreds and thousands of demonstrators belonging primarily to the Yellow Vest activist group have taken to the streets of the capital protesting the Macron government's planned tax hikes on gas. Although the protests initially began as peaceful gatherings of Yellow Vest activists, they quickly turned violent and aggressive as groups of protesters vandalized public property, looted and torched cars.
As I've said to the riot police, it's not the Yellow Vests who are doing the wrecking, it's been the thugs, the ultra-right, the Black Bloc.
Following escalated tensions, over 130 people have been injured and over 400 have been arrested in a series of violent clashes with French law enforcement. As of now, French authorities have not yet called for a state of national emergency, but have put the city of Paris on security lockdown and have made it clear that they're willing to resort to severe measures should these war zone-like conditions continue. Although these protesters initially gathered to show their displeasure for the rising prices of fuel, their protests have since turned into full-scale anti-government demonstrations centering around inequality and a sense of betrayal by the Macron government. Having defeated the evil populist Marine Le Pen in the 2017 elections, French President Emmanuel Macron promised the people of France a democratic and economic revolution, but has failed to deliver on both promises and has since become the laughingstock of the globalist elite. At present, Macron's approval ratings are at an all-time low, and many French citizens feel that their globalist president is solely looking out for the interests of the French elite and the interests of the newly arrived Europeans. If you happen to be a white middle-class citizen who is privileged enough to be living in the culturally enriched European nation of France, then chances are that you're well aware of the long list of problems which are spiraling your country into chaos. At present, France holds the crown as Europe's most heavily taxed country, with latest reports showing that 47.7% of the country's GDP derived from tax revenues in 2017. Traditionally, the French government has always tolerated and defended paying high taxes as the price to pay for public services, as well as the welfare state, which provides protection for the worst off. Couple all of this with constantly increasing fuel taxes, rising petrol costs, and the president who wants to burden its citizens with more carbon taxes, and chances are that you'll get a lot of angry people taking to the streets at a time when they're struggling to make ends meet. Even though the media has attempted to smear the Yellow Vests and paint them as violent rioters, the truth is that these are the people who comprise the dwindling French middle class and those who are most heavily affected by rising fuel prices because they reside in rural areas and are largely dependent on transportation to get to work. Besides Macron's sloppy job of leading his country, the media coverage of the protests in Paris has also been rather sloppy and misleading with the information being presented. As I mentioned earlier, the media had been largely silent on the peaceful demonstrations of the Yellow Vest activists until the protests erupted into violence and chaos in the streets of Paris. In fact, many of us here in North America didn't even know that these demonstrations were happening until images of Paris, looking like a war zone, emerged across various social media platforms sometime late last week. Since then, the majority of mainstream articles have focused around the chaos and violence of the ensuing riots in an attempt to dilute the original cause of the protests while victimizing the president and painting the protests as a personal attack against him. Mainstream news sources have also conveniently failed to mention that these protests, unlike many others in France, are completely organic with no involvement from unions or political parties, which are usually responsible for mobilizing and organizing protesters. These kinds of details are specifically worth mentioning because they reinforce the fact that average European citizens are mobilizing independently in massive numbers to protest their globalist governments because they're sick and tired of their nation's leaders constantly pushing them towards the edge of the cliff. Since the beginning of the protests in Paris, various other Yellow Vest protests have spilled over into cities such as Brussels, proving that the domino effect which the globalist elite fears so greatly has already been set in motion. While protests of this magnitude and size are rare, the people of France have set a clear example that governments who continually choose to fail their people will have no choice but to face the consequences, and that the masses of regular citizens will go to great lengths to initiate change. This kind of national unity and cohesion is exactly what the globalist EU elite has worked so hard to destroy and condemn, and the protests in Paris are a very clear sign of something much bigger and greater to come.